Imagine settling into your airplane seat, excited for your trip.
Oh.
But then you hear a bang, oxygen masks drop, and people start panicking.
Oh, wow.
You glance out the window and see a gaping hole ripped in the side of the aircraft. Sounds terrifying, right?
Yeah, that's pretty scary.
Well, that's exactly what happened on a Boeing 737 MAX just last year.
Really?
This isn't just another news story. This is a deep dive into the troubled history of the Boeing 737 MAX.
Okay.
We're going beyond the headlines to explore what really went wrong, who was held accountable, and whether it could happen again. We've all seen those Boeing commercials touting innovation and safety. But what happens when profits take priority? And how much power do regulators really have? To help us unpack all of this, we have an expert in aviation safety and corporate accountability. Welcome to the show.
It's great to be here. I think this is a story that resonates with a lot of people because we all rely on air travel
Yeah,
and we all expect a certain level of safety when we step on a plane.
absolutely. And this story takes us back to 2011 when Boeing was designing the 737 MAX. They were under immense pressure to compete with Airbus and their fuel-efficient A320neo. To stay in the game, Boeing needed a plane that could match the A320neo's performance, but without requiring extensive pilot retraining,
Right.
which would be a major cost for airlines.
Yeah, definitely. And this is where the seeds of the problem were sown. Boeing decided to modify its existing 737 design rather than creating a completely new aircraft. This allowed them to keep costs down and avoid that lengthy pilot training, but it also meant they were pushing the limits of an aging design.
So, to make this modified 737 work, they introduced a new software system called MCS, the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System.
Uh-huh.
This system was meant to prevent stalls by automatically adjusting the plane's nose down if it sensed a dangerous angle of attack. The problem was that MCS was prone to malfunctioning based on faulty data from a single sensor. And because pilots weren't fully trained on how the system worked or how to override it in case of malfunction, two horrific crashes occurred within 5 months of each other.
Wow.
The first crash, Lion Air Flight 610, plunged into the Java Sea just minutes after takeoff, killing all 189 people on board. Then, just 5 months later, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 crashed shortly after takeoff from Addis Ababa, killing all 157 people on board. A total of 346 lives were lost in these two tragedies.
This is just awful.
And it was the families of the victims who really forced the world to pay attention to the systemic failures that led to these crashes. One of the most powerful voices to emerge was Nadia Miliran, who lost her 24-year-old daughter, Samia, in the Ethiopian Airlines crash.
It's hard to even imagine.
Nadia's story is truly heartbreaking. Imagine losing your child in such a sudden and horrific way. But instead of succumbing to grief, Nadia channeled her pain into action. She became a relentless advocate for justice for the victims, demanding answers from Boeing and pushing for reforms to prevent future tragedies.
Good for her.
What's so remarkable about Nadia and the other families is that they refused to be silenced by Boeing's attempts to downplay the issue or shift blame. They understood that corporate negligence had real-world consequences, and they were determined to hold those responsible accountable.
Right. And their efforts to shine a light on what happened led to a congressional investigation led by Representative Peter DeFazio.
Exactly.
This investigation uncovered some pretty damning evidence, including text messages from a Boeing test pilot, Mark Faulkner.
Ah.
These text messages revealed that Faulkner had expressed concerns about the MCS system during testing, but that these concerns were not adequately addressed by Boeing. He even admitted in these messages that he had unknowingly lied to the FAA about the system's functionality.
Wow, that's huge.
Yeah.
This was a bombshell revelation. It suggested that Boeing knew about the potential dangers of MCS, but chose to prioritize profits over safety. And it also raised serious questions about the FAA's oversight of the 737 MAX certification process.
Yeah, it's a big problem.
So you have this situation where Boeing is trying to downplay the issue, the FAA is trying to protect its own reputation, and the families of the victims are demanding justice. It was a perfect storm of corporate greed, regulatory failure, and human tragedy.
It sounds like it. The pressure on Boeing was immense.
Yeah, I bet.
They were facing multiple lawsuits from the families of the victims, their stock price was plummeting, and the 737 MAX was grounded worldwide. It was a crisis of epic proportions.
So what did Boeing do? Did they take responsibility for their actions and make meaningful changes to their culture and their safety practices?
Well, their initial response was to try to contain the damage. They fired their CEO, Dennis Muhlenberg,
Okay.
and replaced him with David Calhoun, a board member with a background in finance, not engineering, not safety.
That doesn't exactly inspire confidence in their commitment to safety, does it?
Not really, and Calhoun's early statements didn't help matters. He downplayed the cultural issues at Boeing and even suggested that pilot error was a contributing factor in the crashes.
Oh.
This understandably infuriated the families of the victims, who saw it as an attempt to shift blame and avoid accountability.
Right.
Meanwhile, Nadia Milleron's husband, Michael Stumo, was becoming a powerful voice in the fight for justice. He testified before Congress alongside other family members, pushing for stronger FAA oversight and demanding that Boeing be held criminally responsible for their actions.
And what happened?
Stumo and the other family members were relentless. They refused to let Boeing sweep this under the rug. They understood that corporate accountability wasn't just about money. It was about preventing future tragedies and protecting the lives of innocent people.
Yeah, of course.
And then, in a twist of fate, the world's attention was suddenly diverted away from the Boeing crisis by the COVID-19 pandemic. Air travel ground to a halt, the economy went into a tailspin, and the news cycle was dominated by the global health crisis.
Yeah, I remember that. Everything kind of got put on hold.
It's almost as if the pandemic gave Boeing a temporary reprieve. The urgency to address the 737 MAX issues seemed to fade as the world grappled with a more immediate threat. But, as we'll see, the underlying problems at Boeing were far from over.
Okay.
And those problems came back to haunt them in a terrifying way in January 2024 with the Alaska Airlines Flight 1282 incident. This flight was on a Boeing 737-900ER, not a 737 MAX, but the incident itself raised serious concerns about Boeing's overall safety culture.
Right.
Remember that gaping hole we talked about at the beginning?
Oh, yeah.
That's what happened on this flight. Mid-flight, a door plug, which is basically a panel filling the space where an emergency exit would be, ripped open. Thankfully, no one was killed and the plane managed to land safely, but it could have been a catastrophe.
It's chilling to think about what could have happened, especially if the incident had occurred at a higher altitude or over water.
Exactly. The investigation revealed that the door plug hadn't been properly secured during maintenance, which pointed to a breakdown in Boeing's quality control procedures.
So even after two deadly crashes and years of scrutiny, Boeing was still struggling with basic safety protocols.
Yeah, and what's even more concerning is that Boeing admitted they had a request for maintenance on that door plug, but no record of whether it was inspected afterward.
Wow. It's like they hadn't learned anything.
And this incident had major consequences for Boeing. The FAA grounded the 737 MAX 9, and whistleblowers started coming forward, revealing even more safety and quality control issues across different Boeing models.
So this isn't just limited to the 737 MAX.
It was like a dam had broken and the flood of bad news just kept coming.
It sounds like things were really spiraling out of control for Boeing.
At this point, it was clear that the 2021 Deferred Prosecution Agreement, which Boeing had entered into to avoid criminal charges for the MCS debacle, was hanging by a thread. This agreement included a stipulation that if they violated the law again within 3 years, they would be open to criminal charges.
Right, I see.
And with the door plug incident happening within that 3-year window, the families of the crash victims who had been pushing for true accountability all along saw an opportunity to finally get justice.
So what did they do?
They met with the Department of Justice and presented compelling evidence that Boeing had violated the terms of the agreement. They argued that the Alaska Airlines incident, along with the whistleblowers' accounts, proved that Boeing's misconduct was ongoing and that they needed to be held accountable.
That makes sense.
And the DOJ was listening. In May 2024, they announced that Boeing had indeed violated the Deferred Prosecution Agreement. This opened the door for criminal charges related to the MCS debacle, something the families had been fighting for all along.
It was a major victory for the families, but the fight was far from over.
Right. Boeing tried to downplay the situation, but the writing was on the wall. They knew they couldn't escape accountability this time.
So what happened next? Did Boeing finally admit their guilt and face the consequences of their actions? So did Boeing finally admit their guilt?
They did. In a historic move, Boeing agreed to plead guilty to charges of defrauding the government. This was a major turning point.
Yeah.
It marked the first time that a major U.S. aircraft manufacturer had been convicted of a felony related to safety.
That's huge. So what were the consequences?
Well, in addition to the guilty plea, Boeing had to pay a substantial fine, over $2.5 billion.
Wow.
They were also placed on probation for 3 years, and an independent compliance officer was appointed to oversee their safety practices.
It sounds like they were finally being held accountable.
To a certain extent, yes.
Yeah.
But the question remains, can a fine, however large, truly change a corporate culture that has become so entrenched in prioritizing profits over safety?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah. It is.
Yeah.
And to complicate matters further, Boeing appointed a new CEO, Kelly Ortberg,
Okay.
an engineer with a strong background in aviation. On the surface, this seemed like a step in the right direction.
Right, but remember David Calhoun, the previous CEO, also promised change and accountability, yet here we are.
Precisely. So while this new CEO's background might offer a glimmer of hope,
Yeah.
it's crucial to remember that real change requires more than just a change at the top.
Uh-huh.
It requires a fundamental shift in priorities, a commitment to transparency and accountability, and a willingness to put safety above all else.
And that's where we as passengers come in. We can't just be passive observers in this. We have a role to play in demanding accountability and pushing for change.
Absolutely. One of the most powerful things we can do is stay informed. Read beyond the headlines,
Okay.
dig into the investigations, understand the issues at play.
Right.
The more we know, the better equipped we are to demand better from the companies we do business with, including the airlines we fly.
We also need to support the organizations and individuals who are fighting for stricter regulations and greater transparency in the aviation industry. Groups like the one Nadia Milron is a part of are working tirelessly to prevent future tragedies, and they deserve our support.
It's also important to remember that safety isn't just Boeing's responsibility. The FAA, as the regulatory body, needs to be more proactive, more vigilant, and more willing to hold manufacturers accountable. We need to demand strong leadership and effective oversight from the agencies that are supposed to protect us.
This entire story has been a wake-up call.
Definitely.
It's a reminder that even the most reputable companies can make mistakes, and that those mistakes can have devastating consequences.
It's also a reminder that we as consumers have a voice and that we need to use it to demand better from the companies we rely on. Our safety and the safety of our loved ones depends on it.
Thank you for joining us on The Deep Dive. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay safe.